Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Meetinghouse of Provincetown, where we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and where we support each other on our spiritual search for truth and meaning. Welcome to those of you in the room, you brave and hardy souls. You're like, hail, sleet, snow, no problem, I'm there. And welcome also to those of you joining us from home, a larger crew, I think, via YouTube. My name is Rev Kate Wilkinson, and I am so glad that you are with us this morning. Actually, I'm so glad that I'm with you this morning. Yes. It has been a while since I have gotten out of bed. If you were here last week, you know that Lisa had COVID, then I had COVID, and now we are finally feeling better. But man, even a mild case of COVID is no joke, you guys. Please stay safe out there and wear those masks. But I thank you for being so sweet to us. And I thank the worship committee for covering for me last week, and Will and Ellen for leading coffee hour, and friends and neighbors who went to the store for us and brought us soup. Ada brought us soup. How sweet is that? Please keep taking care of each other. It makes such a difference. A few quick announcements. Out of an abundance of caution, I will not be doing a receiving line today. You don't want to shake my hand. Also, maybe you have heard that our dear beloved Lawrence is moving, and his last day is going to be the 29th of this month. So I have this idea, block your ears, Lawrence, watching at home. I have this idea to flood him with cards on that day. So please bring or send in cards for Lawrence before the 29th. Our office is closed tomorrow for Martin Luther King Day, but those of you who wish to be together, please join me and Racial Justice Provincetown for the Martin Luther King Walk happening in Wellfleet. There is a drumming and singing circle at 12:30 in front of the Wellfleet Town Hall, and then a silent community walk to the library and back. It's really a very moving event that they do every year. You can make your own posters, or we will be bringing some as well that you can carry. So we'll see you there. Let's take a moment now to affirm our Meetinghouse covenant. I will say a line, and then you can say it back to me. Love is the spirit of this Meetinghouse. This is our great covenant. To dwell together in peace. To seek the truth in love. And to help one another. And now, as we light our chalice here in the sanctuary, I invite those of you watching from home to light a candle wherever you are. That way we can feel connected even while we are apart.
Chalice Lighting by Rebecca Savage. This, a chalice of audacious hope. This chalice shines a light on our shared past, signaling our intention to listen deeply, reflect wisely, and move boldly toward our highest ideals.
Thank you. So before we move on with our service today, I want to do something kind of different and fun. Well, the introverts in the room are not going to think that it is fun. You are going to wish that I was still out with COVID. But the extroverts might enjoy this, so let's give it a whirl. In your pews, you will find some paper and golf pencils. And if you don't have any in your pew, you can look around in the pews around you. If you are at home, find yourself a piece of paper and a writing implement. And in a minute, not just yet, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to get into groups of 3 or 4 for the 7 principle challenge. So if you need to stay away from people for COVID reasons, just give a little sign that you're keeping to yourself, and we'll respect that. But if you're just an introvert wanting to avoid working in a group, just push yourself a little, stretch. I promise it won't be too bad. Everyone keep your masks on, of course, for this. Your challenge is to, as a group, and to the best of your abilities and memory, list the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. Now, don't cheat by looking at your phone. Just list as many as you can remember, even if you don't get the wording quite right. Visitors, you may have never heard of the 7 principles. That's totally okay. You can still get in a group and listen in. The 7 principles are some guiding ideas that inspire Unitarian Universalists in our religious journeying together. Ready? You get the assignment? Okay. Let's go. Take a few minutes. Be nice to our visitors. Include them. You have to move about the space. Larger groups are fine. All right, just one more minute on this, as many as you can remember. All right, before I lose you completely, let's finish up wherever you are and come back to your seats. How'd we do? I'm not going to ask you to read them out, but do any of your groups think you got all 7? No. Okay. Good job. Thank you for playing. Our reading this morning, which is a little later in the service, is going to be the 7 principles. So you can confirm and amend your lists then. If you're just dying to know, they are also printed in the beginning pages of our hymnals as part of the preface. But let's join now in a time of meditation and prayer. As I share our prayer, or at any time during the service, you are welcome to light a silent candle at the table to the right of the pulpit, where there is a journal to record your thoughts and prayers. After our prayer, we will sing together Spirit of Life, which is hymn number 123, and you can also find the words to this song printed on purple laminated cards in your pews. Might be in the stack of hymnals. Our prayer this morning is by Kathleen Rowlands, written for Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday. Spirit of justice, God who befriends those who stand upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, we are grateful to be gathered together this morning. We gather especially to remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but not only him, for there were thousands of unnamed women and men, people who put their bodies and lives on the line so that all may be free. And yet freedom comes at a cost, and we know that racism and homophobia, ageism and ableism, sexism and classism, all of these often unacknowledged realities prevent us from fully knowing one another, from creating the beloved community spoken of by prophets and ordinary persons alike. May the work of Dr. King continue to eradicate injustice wherever and whenever we encounter it. May we continue to speak out against injustice, to speak even if we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. May the spirit of Dr. King continue to flow through our daily living. May we have the courage of Dr. King as we continue to stand up for justice, reconciliation, and truth, despite challenge and controversy. Dr. King went to the mountaintop. He saw the promised land, and he reassured us that we will get there one day. May that not be a dream, but a reality in our own time. May it be so. Amen.
Spirit of life, come unto me, sing in my heart blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Fuente de amor, ven hacia mí y al corazón cántale tu compasión. Sopla volar, sube en la mar, hasta moldear la justicia de la vida. Arrégame, libérame, fuente de amor, ven a mí, ven a mí.
The 7 UU principles. Unitarian Universalist congregations affirm and promote 7 principles, which we hold as strong values and moral guides. We live out these principles within a living tradition of wisdom and spirituality, drawn from sources as diverse as science, poetry, scripture, and personal experience. As Reverend Barbara Wells Ten Hove explains, the principles are not dogma or doctrine, but rather a guide for those of us who choose to join and participate in Unitarian Universalist religious communities. First principle: the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Second, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Third, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Fourth, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Fifth, the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Sixth, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Seventh, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part.
I know you guys are thinking, I knew that one. Now is the time in our service where we take a collection for our shared ministry. If you are giving online, you can go to our website, uumh.org, use PayPal or Venmo. On and off-site, your donations will now be gratefully received.
Though days be dark with storms and burdens weigh my heart, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. When sorrow heals my soul and burdens make me strong, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. My sister in my heart, my brother in my song, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. And though the journey is long, the destination is dear, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. So brothers, take my hand, and sisters, sing my song. Though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. Though troubles wait at every turn, I know
we can go
on. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so why are we talking about the 7 principles today? And how does it relate to Martin Luther King Day? Bear with me. It all comes together eventually. As Unitarian Universalists, we sometimes say that we are a non-creedal faith. What is a creed? My friend and colleague Tim Kutzmark, who is a UU minister out in Fresno, California, describes it this way. He says, a creed is a set of beliefs, a way of thinking that has been determined by other people sometime in the past. And in a religious setting, we are expected to set our hearts on those ways of thinking. Someone figured out this truth and it resonates with me and I accept it. And creeds are wonderful things for folks who gravitate toward creeds, Tim says, but Unitarian Universalists are a rambunctious bunch and we do not gravitate toward creeds. We're not saying anything negative about creeds, but we believe that we need not think alike to love alike. So what we have as Unitarian Universalists is a covenant. It's a set of promises that we're going to try to hold to about how to be in relationship with each other and with the world. It's less about what we think and more about how we behave, how we act, how we want to be in the world. And it's aspirational, meaning we don't always get it right. But we promise that when we mess up, we will try again, and we will try to do better. Now, we also have our own congregational covenant or affirmation that we say each week here, which is the same kind of thing, a promise that we are making to one another as a community to try to love one another, try to help one another, to seek the truth, to dwell in peace with one another. But as a larger denomination, what we are promising to one another as Unitarian Universalists all over the country and in some other places in the world is summed up in our core 7 principles. We covenant to affirm and promote. The 7 principles are about how we want to be in relationship with each other and the world, how we're going to behave, how we're going to act. We covenant to affirm and promote these things. Now, in this moment within our denomination, there's something happening. From a sort of grassroots uprising, you might say, a movement to add an 8th principle to our 7 principles. And this 8th principle lifts up the experience of people of color in our denomination particularly. It recognizes that one of the things that has really been getting in the way of our promises to each other is that we have been steeped in a white supremacy culture, and our denomination has been shaped by this larger culture. Now, when I say that Unitarian Universalism has a white supremacy culture, I don't mean that the leaders of our faith movement are Ku Klux Klan members, or that any of us intentionally subscribe to the belief that white people have more inherent worth and dignity than people of color. We would be totally horrified at that. Unitarian Universalists have a long history of working for racial justice. It is foundational for us from the time of the abolitionist movement through to the civil rights era, and today with our support of the Black Lives Matter movement. When Martin Luther King called for clergy to join him in Selma, hundreds of Unitarian Universalists answered that call, including 1 out of every 5 of our ministers all across the country who dropped everything and went. What I mean when I say white supremacy culture is that we have a very white way of doing things because our norms have been shaped over hundreds of years, primarily by white people. It's the same with this country as a whole. The default system is set up for white people because it was created by white people. Let me give you an example. A number of years ago, at a worship committee meeting, we were talking about how awkward it felt to us that sometimes people clap after sacred music. I mean, not when it's a particularly rousing song that the choir has really rocked, like today. That felt right. But I mean, when it was a really peaceful piece of music that was meditative and spiritual, and then people clap. Like after Spirit of Life, for example. Sometimes people would clap after a song like that, and it felt so jarring to us, and it took us out of that peaceful spiritual mood. And so we were talking about that and brainstorming about that, and someone said, well, maybe we could put a little note in the order of service, something about staying peaceful and contemplative after songs like that. And we were actually considering that, I remember, because we were trying to solve this problem of the inappropriate clapping, you see. And I remember that at that time, Christy Hardwick was on the worship committee. And she is a Black woman and also a minister. And I can't remember how she put it exactly, but I remember that she was very kind about it, but also very clear and passionate. And the gist of what she said to us very kindly was, really, guys? You want to police clapping? You want to tell a room full of people who experience the Spirit differently from one another that clapping, responding bodily to what you've witnessed and felt, is forbidden? And then she said, because I would never want to attend a church that did that. And it would actually make me feel extremely unwelcome here, because in the traditions that I am from, clapping and responding with my body and my voice, that isn't inappropriate. Okay, that's how we show how very spiritual and moving it is. And I have never forgotten that moment. because it showed me how very much I have blinders on to the only view of the world that I have through my own experience and aesthetic and sense of what is right. And also to the power I have in the system to perpetuate only that way of seeing things, right? I mean, I could have, almost did, police clapping right there in our order of service. And if Christy hadn't been on that committee and said those things, I never would have realized how unwelcoming a space we were creating, or who might have visited and never come back because of the message we were giving. And we would have just kept scratching our heads being like, I wonder why we don't ever have more black members. Another Unitarian joke, by the way, that makes more and more sense to me is that we are God's frozen chosen. Because we think that the very best way to respond to being spiritually moved is to sit completely still and not tell anyone about it. Now, I'm joking here, but think about it. If one little decision made on a random Thursday afternoon about how we talk about clapping could have this impact of making people of color or those from more evangelical or emotive backgrounds feel so unwelcome, what about all the other decisions that we're making as people in power that affect our culture and our traditions and norms? Now, there's a lot there, too much to dig into today. But the point is that we need to listen to people of color in our denomination who are sharing their lived experiences because there is wisdom there that we need to hear. And folks of color haven't always been at the table of decision making, but now they are, and the rest of us need to listen. And so it is folks of color who are proposing that we add an 8th principle to our 7 principles that addresses this commitment to listen, this commitment to taking our blinders off, this commitment to deepening our sense of spirituality through relationship. Because the principles are about how we want to be together, right? So this is the proposed 8th principle. We covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. If we vote and add this to our principles, we will be publicly adding this to our promises to try to live more fully into that dream of being a more multiracial, more multicultural, more spiritually whole community. Now, there is a lot of support for this 8th principle, but I have to tell you, there is also a lot of opposition to it. And I think that it has to do with a sort of sense of shame that we are not already living into this ideal of beloved community that we have already been taking credit for, and a leeriness of that word accountability, and also a weariness of talking about race. But instead of saying that, a lot of the pushback has been taking 2 forms. One, that the language is not poetic enough. And this is the equivalent of us saying that we don't want clapping in worship, right? because my personal aesthetic sensibilities are more important than listening to your voice that has been silenced for so long. And I think that the whole denomination just needs a sort of wake-up call, like the one that Reverend Christie gave to our committee all those years ago, where we see that there are multiple values that we might hold dear at the same time. Beautiful, precise, symmetrical language, and inclusivity, solidarity, actually listening and responding to our siblings of color. And we realize that the latter is obviously the more important one in this moment. Now, tied into the language thing is the feedback that we can't possibly memorize that. And to that, I just say, based on this morning's experiment, folks, we weren't that great at memorizing the first 7 either. Let's just be honest about that. And the other pushback, number 2, is that we do not like change. These are our beloved 7 principles. They are what tie our faith together, hold our faith together, and they have always been this way, and they cannot be changed. And to this I say, well, that's just not true. We are a living, breathing, changing faith. We have a tradition that goes back 2,000 years, but we are a living, changing faith, and I am so grateful for that, both the tradition and the change. I'm grateful for tradition because look where we get to sit on Sunday mornings. Look where we get to live stream into on Sunday mornings. This beautiful sanctuary. Look at that ceiling for a second if you're in the room. This was built for us by seekers 176 years ago. And if they had not tended to tradition and passed on tradition, we would not be the inheritors of this incredible sacred space and community today. Probably be condos, right? Someone would be looking at that ceiling from bed. But someone tended to that religious tradition. And yet, if those folks over the years had clung too vigorously to tradition, well, I would not be here speaking to you today, right? I'm a woman, I am queer, I'm a spiritual humanist, I like contemporary music and worship, yes? These things would have gotten me booted out of here so fast throughout most of our history. But not today, because we've grown and changed throughout those years. We have reassessed what was important to us in the new moment. And that wasn't just happening here in Provincetown, that's been happening all over the United States and the world throughout the history of Unitarian Universalism. And so to respond to the we can't change the 7 principles argument, I think we need a little reminder of our history here. And again, I'm going to lean on my friend Tim Kutzmark's framework, with many thanks to him. A little history lesson. Unitarians and Universalists, for most of our history, were 2 separate strains of thought, both of which traced their beliefs back to Judaism and the early teachings and followers of Jesus. The Universalists were most concerned with the nature of God, and the Unitarians were most concerned with the nature of Jesus and human beings. The Universalists said that if there is a God, then that God is a God of love, and no God of love would damn us to eternal damnation, which was what the church was teaching at that time. Salvation came to all, the Universalists believed, from God's universal love. Universalism. The Unitarians focused on Jesus. They believed that Jesus was a human being Not just any human being, though. A human being living to the fullest of his potential, the most self-actualized human being there could be, the most self-differentiated and most grounded and centered and wise and spiritual human being they could think of. They believed that we were not stained with original sin, but that we all had this potential within us like Jesus did. Salvation came from human beings becoming fully realized. Salvation came in this life through human efforts to better themselves. And there's an old joke that I like to tell at new member classes that the Universalists thought God was too good to damn us, and the Unitarians thought we are too good to be damned. And they both started out as Bible-based and Jesus-focused free thought Christians, and they both got more and more liberal over the years. Some Unitarians in the 1800s began to embrace transcendentalism and other outside-the-box ideas. They introduced some pretty radical religious thinking to Christianity. They said, you don't necessarily need stories from the Bible to understand religion. You can experience the divine on your own, in nature. They began to look beyond the Bible to other religious traditions. They thought there was a greater truth than one scripture could contain. They started turning to Eastern wisdom. It was very controversial. Some of the Unitarians were horrified. They tried to kick out Ralph Waldo Emerson. Didn't work. These ideas were catching on, especially as Unitarianism moved west. And then in the 1900s, a new divide emerged. The humanists made an appearance. Now they said, you don't need God in order to be good. We can figure out how to treat each other. We can figure out how to be religious, even without God. And the Christian Unitarians were horrified. And the Transcendentalists were horrified too, because they believed the divine to be central to their mystical exploration, even if they defined it differently. But things were changing. Now, Universalists were also getting more and more liberal. They were still Jesus-based, but they were more and more about how would Jesus have acted in the world, focusing on some of the same social justice concerns that the Unitarians were: economic justice, racial justice, women's rights. They had this in common. And they were also both, by that time, this was now the 1950s, small. They were struggling to support themselves as denominations. Fewer liberal people were even going to church. And the two denominations began to see that they should probably merge, join forces. They had a lot in common. But there was a problem. Their written statements of belief were so different, it felt impossible to merge them. Now, in the 1950s, these were the 5 principles of Unitarianism: individual freedom of belief, discipleship to advancing truth, the democratic process in human relations, universal brotherhood, undivided by nation, race, or creed, and an allegiance to the cause of a united world community. It's not very spiritual language. All that had been stripped out with endless wordsmithing, trying to water it down to find something that everyone could agree on: the theists and the transcendentalists and the humanists. Now, contrast that to the Universalists. Now, we were Universalists, by the way, in this place, whose language in the 50s said things like, the bond of fellowship in this church shall be a common purpose to do the will of God as Jesus revealed it, and to cooperate in establishing the kingdom for which he lived and died. To that end, we avow our faith in God as eternal and all-conquering love, in the spiritual leadership of Jesus, in the supreme worth of every human personality, in the authority of truth known or to be known, and in the power of men of goodwill and sacrificial spirit to overcome evil and progressively establish the kingdom of God. So as they are moving toward a merger, it explodes into a real battle as to what should make it into the statement of common belief or their guiding principles. And of course, there were no women in the room as this was being discussed. There were no people of color. There were no lay people. It was all white male ministers who were having the discussion. Somehow, they hammered it out, though, because they saw the potential of joining together. And this was formalized in 1961 when the Unitarian Universalist Association was born, to carry on tradition and to continue changing together. So what did the first joint principles look like back then in 1961? There were 6: to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth as the foundation of our religious fellowship, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships, to implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on the ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion, to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. It was a miracle they could agree on any language at all. That's what they came up with. But do you know who didn't like it? The women. Did you hear how many times they said men, brotherhood, fellowship? There was so much sexist language in there, and the women did not feel represented. From the start, they wanted to change it. And by this point, our relationship to the environment was becoming one of our primary religious concerns. So in the 1970s, environmentalists were also pushing for a new formulation which would reflect that. But the white male ministers wanted to remain in control. It had taken a lot of work to come up with that language. They did not want to change. So it took 23 years. But finally, the women and the environmentalists and those who yearned for more spiritual and inspiring language prevailed. And that was how our beloved principles came into being and became what they are today, brought before the General Assembly 2 years in a row, voted on almost unanimously in 1985. Now, there's one nay vote from a guy in the back. There's always a guy in the back. And now, today, we are in another historic moment. Over 200 congregations in this grassroots effort have added a new principle, the 8th principle that I read to you earlier. And this is happening church by church, not yet by a vote at the General Assembly. This is being driven by individual congregations who are following the lead of BIPOC Unitarian Universalists, Black, Indigenous, people of color in our congregations. Why am I preaching about this today on Martin Luther King Sunday? First, because it's about building beloved community. According to Barbara Holmes, the term beloved community was first coined by American philosopher Josiah Royce, who lived between 1855 and 1916, way back then. But you probably know it most from Martin Luther King Jr., who used the phrase in his sermons to describe the dream we are working toward, right? Beloved community. But according to Holmes, the community called beloved is not a static idea. It can be revised. During the 1960s, she said, we imagined such a community through the image of children of different ethnic backgrounds playing together. But perhaps we need a different vision now, she says, a vision that includes mutual obligations and belonging. obligation, Holmes says, is the awareness of our intrinsic connectedness to each other. Now, Martin Luther King, in his time, put out a call for people of good faith to join him in the fight against racism. He asked people to join him in Selma, in Montgomery, in Washington, D.C. And some of you here in this room, in our membership, answered the call at that time. And some of you wish you had. Some of us were not alive yet. And we imagine, would we have answered that call? Would we have been committed enough, brave enough, clear enough on the value of standing together against systems of power, many of which benefit those of us who are white? Would we have answered that call? We think about that. But his was not the last call being made, right? Selma was not the last legitimate call to join in the fight to end oppression and inequity for people of color. There have been countless calls since then, and we are also being called today, from within our denomination even, to gather on the side of justice and love and inclusivity. We are being called by Black, Indigenous people of color within Unitarian Universalism to answer the call by adopting the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism. And the other reason that I'm talking about this today is because I think that sometimes we have a very skewed version of the timeline of history. It's not our fault. Things taught from books feel very far away. But we have a hard time realizing the scale of time when we learn things as history. For instance, I learned about Anne Frank when I was about 11 years old, and it felt like a very close story in some ways because she was a girl about my age, and it was so captivating to my heart. But it also felt like very long ago history because I had no sense that something like that could ever happen today in my world. And I learned about Martin Luther King Jr. in school and continued to learn about him in college and even in more depth in graduate school at the very same divinity school that he attended, Boston University School of Theology. That's right. But that also felt like the distant past because the footage was all in black and white. And I could never imagine something like that happening today in my world. And then the other day, Barbara Walters died. And that felt very present because I grew up watching her and listening to her, and it was in color. And she died on December 30th, 2022, when she was 93 years old. And we have a member here who is older than that. And then I saw somewhere that had they lived, Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. would have been the same exact age as Barbara Walters. They were contemporaries. They were all born in 1929. And that just stopped me in my tracks. Because people who I have always thought of as distant history could really still be alive today if they had not been killed. So it is not really that old of history. It is very recent history. And I think about how much has changed since their deaths, how very much society has changed, and also some of the ways in which it hasn't, some of the ways in which those things could happen, again, if we are not careful, brave, committed. And those seven principles that some people are so attached to not changing, they feel foundational in some ways. I grew up with them. They have always been my tool for explaining my faith, but they are younger than me, and they are not in their first version. They were not written on stone tablets. They were written jointly by people around a table doing the best they could at the time, and some people were missing around that table. So, of course they can still change, should change. We forget that history includes us. Someday, books will be, one day in the future, written about this time. And it won't be a question of what would we have done. It will be a question of what did we do? And sometimes, more importantly, what we did not do in our time. And soon, I'm coming to the end here, I promise. Soon, we will have an opportunity to vote on the 8th principle here at the Unitarian Universalist Meetinghouse of Provincetown. We are reading through our bylaws, figuring out the best way to do that. So our task now is to listen to how the Spirit, the world, the beloved community is calling to us today. And as we answer that call, we too will be part of the tradition and part of the change. May it be so. Amen. And blessed be.
It has become our practice to pose a question based on the theme of the service each week. It can be a topic of sharing as you leave today with your friends during the week. If you want to delve deeper into this conversation, we hope you can join us Tuesday at 5 on our Zoom coffee hour. Our question this week is, what are your thoughts on the proposed 8th principle?
Unitarian minister and transcendentalist Theodore Parker and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. remind us that the moral arc of the universe is long, but that it bends toward justice. May we take every opportunity to grab hold of it and bend it down all the way into our lives. Go in peace.